I was 13, maybe 14, when it happened. My hometown was a quiet place, the kind of suburb where nothing exciting ever really went down. It had its fair share of walking and biking trails, stretching through the woods and leading to the local lake, a popular spot in the summer. I spent most of my free time outdoors, usually biking aimlessly around town with my best friend, Anthony. His neighborhood was just across from mine, and I'd often walk over to his house, knock on his door, and see if he wanted to go ride. That day was no different. It was warm, and the sky was that pale shade of blue that only seemed to exist in the afternoons of childhood summers. Anthony was down to go biking, so we set off, weaving through our usual spots before deciding to head toward the lake. It was never empty this time of year. Families, joggers, and other kids filled the gravel paths that wound through the trees. To get to the lake, we had to pass through a tunnel beneath the main road. It wasn't anything special, just a 20-foot-long concrete passage with graffiti on the walls and a slight echo if you spoke loudly enough. The paved path sloped down toward it, and once inside, the air always felt a little cooler, the outside world momentarily cut off. It was one of our favorite places to hang out, not because it was hidden, but because the tunnel amplified our music when we played it through our iPods. That's where we were when we saw him. Anthony and I were leaning against our bikes, laughing about something stupid, when I noticed movement on the far side of the tunnel. A man had just stepped inside. He was walking toward us, and something about him made my stomach twist. He was dressed all wrong for a cop: cargo shorts, a green tank top, sandals, and a huge military-style backpack slung over one shoulder. His skin looked wrong. Even from a distance, I could tell it was greasy, almost slick with sweat, and his dark hair was tangled and unkempt. But it was his eyes that scared me the most. They were locked on me with a strange, unsettling intensity, as if he had already decided something about me, something I didn't understand yet. "Hey," the man called out. His voice echoed off the tunnel walls. I stiffened. "I'm a police officer." The words didn't match the man standing before me. There was no badge, no uniform. Nothing about him suggested law enforcement. Anthony had noticed too. I saw him shift uneasily beside me, gripping the handlebars of his bike a little tighter. A slow, knowing smile spread across the man's face, and he took another step forward. Instinct took over. I didn't think. I just acted. "Anthony, run!" I yelled. He didn't hesitate. He threw himself onto his bike and kicked off hard, the wheels spinning fast as he shot forward. But the man was closer to him than I had realized. As Anthony passed, the man lunged, his fingers closing around Anthony's arm in a tight grip. Anthony yelped and skidded sideways, nearly losing his balance. For a split second, I thought he was going to be dragged off his bike. But the man's grip loosened, his attention flicked back to me. And I knew in that moment that he wasn't after Anthony. He was after me. Anthony didn't waste his chance. He yanked his arm free and pedaled as hard as he could toward the street, disappearing into the sunlight beyond the tunnel. I was alone. The man stepped closer, his hand still outstretched, as if he hadn't quite processed that Anthony had escaped. My heart was slamming against my ribs, my breath coming fast and shallow. The only way out was past him, unless... My eyes darted to the side. There was a narrow dirt path cutting up the embankment near where I stood. It was steep and covered in loose gravel, but it led back up to the main road. I grabbed my bike, swung one leg over, and pushed off. "Hey," the man barked. I barely made it 2 feet before my tires lost grip. The dirt was too loose, the incline too sharp. I couldn't pedal up. Behind me, heavy footsteps pounded against the tunnel floor. "Didn't your parents ever teach you not to run from the cops?" His voice had changed. The casual, almost friendly tone was gone. Now it was sharp, edged with something ugly. I had no choice. I abandoned my bike, letting it clatter onto its side, and bolted up the dirt path on foot. The man's footsteps thundered behind me. I ran harder. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Halfway up the trail, the sound of his pursuit suddenly stopped. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was standing at the base of the incline, breathing hard, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his nostrils flaring. Then, slowly, a smirk crept across his face. He turned around, walked over to my bike, and lifted it effortlessly. And then, just like that, he rode away on it. I didn't move until he was gone, the sound of the stolen bike's tires fading into the distance. When I finally made it to the top of the trail, I ran straight to the library, where I found a payphone and called the cops. By the time they arrived, I had already walked home, shaking with adrenaline and fear. A few hours later, an officer showed up at my door with a photo lineup. I didn't even have to think. I spotted the man instantly. The cop nodded grimly. Yeah, we know him. Him and his twin brother. They're homeless meth addicts. They steal bikes sometimes, but nothing this bold. I swallowed, my throat dry. So, what happens now? We'll pick him up, the officer assured me. I nodded, but a cold feeling crept into my stomach. Because even as I sat there, surrounded by the safety of my home, I couldn't shake the way the man had looked at me. As if stealing my bike had never been the real goal. As if I had been the one thing he truly wanted. And for some reason, he had let me go. The first time I met Jake, I thought he was charming. I was 18 and had been working as a 911 dispatcher for about 3 months in a small city. We handled law enforcement, fire, and EMS for the entire county, which meant I had frequent interactions with officers from multiple agencies. Most of them were older, gruff men who viewed me as little more than a voice on the other end of the radio. But not Jake. Jake was different. He was new to our department, having transferred from a big city in California. No one really knew why he had left a larger, more prestigious agency to work in our quiet little town. When asked, he always gave vague, easy answers. Just needed a change, or too much stress back there. Nothing that raised alarms, at least, not at first. We started talking during shift breaks. He was funny and confident, the kind of guy who always seemed to know the right thing to say. It didn't take long before our casual conversations turned into flirting, and soon after, something more. I fell for him fast. For a while, everything seemed perfect. He would text me good morning before my shifts, send me inside jokes throughout the day, and call me at night just to chat. I was young, naive, and flattered by the attention of a man several years older than me, especially one who carried a badge. But then, little things started to feel off. At first, it was just subtle possessiveness. He wanted to know where I was, who I was with, when I got off work. I brushed it off as concern. But over time, it became more insistent. If I took too long to respond to a text, he'd call over and over until I answered. If I mentioned hanging out with male coworkers, his mood would shift, his responses clipped and cold. I should have seen the red flags, but I didn't. Not until the day he got fired. It happened suddenly. 1 minute, Jake was joking with me in the break room, and the next, he was being escorted out of the building by a sergeant. The news spread quickly. He'd been caught doing something inappropriate with photos and videos of me. While on duty, I didn't understand at first. The officers wouldn't tell me the details, just that it was bad enough to get him stripped of his badge and fired on the spot. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. A week later, his sergeant pulled me aside. Listen, he said, his tone carefully neutral. We think you should consider filing for a protective order. I stared at him. Why? He hesitated. Because Jake made some concerning statements before he left. My stomach twisted. What kind of statements? The sergeant sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was upset. Said things like, I'll find out if she's lying. Stuff that could be interpreted as threats. I felt cold all over. Still, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Protective orders were for people in real danger. Jake wasn't dangerous, was he? I told myself it was over. That he was gone. Then, 2 weeks after his termination, Jake called me. I hesitated before answering. Against my better judgment, I picked up. The conversation started normally enough. He asked how I was, what I'd been up to, if I was still working at the station. But then, slowly, the questions grew more personal. When's your shift over? What kind of car are you driving these days? I felt uneasy, but I answered. He was an old friend, wasn't he? Someone I used to trust? After I hung up, I called his old department, just like the sergeant had instructed. I told them Jake had reached out. They brushed me off. He's not our problem anymore, one of them said. Just block his number. So I did. A month passed. I started to relax. Maybe Jake had moved on. Maybe I had overreacted. Then, one night, he called again from a different number. I hesitated. Then I answered. Hey, he said casually. Long time no talk. I swallowed. Jake, you can't keep. Listen, he interrupted. I'm thinking about buying a house. I frowned. Okay. In your neighborhood. A sick feeling crept into my gut. I never told you where I live, I said slowly. Silence. Then, a chuckle. Didn't have to. I felt like I was going to be sick. Jake, this has to stop. Come on, he coaxed. We were good together, weren't we? If I knew I was going to get canned, I would have had my way with you when I had the chance. I froze. He laughed again, like it was a joke. Maybe we should get a hotel room. Just us. Catch up. I hung up and blocked the number. The next morning, I saw him. I was leaving for work when I spotted a familiar car parked at the end of my street. The windows were tinted, but I knew it was him. He was watching me. I called the police. They took a report, but without actual evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. You should think about that protective order, one of them said. I nodded numbly. For the next few weeks, I saw Jake everywhere. At the grocery store, outside my gym, across the parking lot from my work. Always watching, never approaching. Then, one night, he FaceTimed me. I don't know why I answered. Maybe I needed proof. Maybe I needed to hear him say something that could get him arrested. At first, it was normal. He was sick, laying in bed, complaining about his new dog. Then, mid-conversation, his expression changed. You know, he said, his voice quieter now. I think about you. A lot. I stayed silent. You ever think about me? I started to answer, but then I noticed something. His hand was moving beneath the blanket. Revulsion crawled up my spine. I ended the call and blocked him again. The next day, I filed for the protective order. Jake tried to follow me on social media. I ignored him. Then, the sightings started again. I would catch glimpses of him, just out of reach. Last I knew, he lived 30 to 45 minutes away. So why was he always here? Watching. Waiting. I don't know what he wants. But I know one thing. He hasn't given up. My mother has always been a strong woman. Tough, smart, and fiercely protective. But there was one story from her past that she never told lightly. It happened when she was 16. She grew up in a small town in the 1980s, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and high school football was practically a religion. Her parents were divorced, and she lived with her mother and younger brother. My grandmother worked late most nights, leaving my mom with more freedom than most kids her age. And she took advantage of it. She smoked, drank, and partied with her friends whenever she could, sneaking out more often than not. It was a game, dodging parents, running across backyards, laughing as they disappeared into the night. That night had started like any other. She and her 3 friends, 2 girls and 1 guy, had been drinking heavily at a party. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the sound of a cheap stereo blasting classic rock through the night. By midnight, they were all giggling, stumbling, and drunker than they should have been. Then someone suggested going for a drive. They piled into an old, beat-up sedan and took off down the empty country roads. My mother sat in the back seat, the cool night air whipping through the open windows, carrying the scent of farmland and summer heat. The laughter in the car was loud and careless, but it died the second they saw the flashing lights. Red and blue flickered in the rearview mirror. A cop was pulling them over. Panic set in instantly. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" One of the girls whimpered, clutching my mother's arm. "We're gonna get arrested." The driver, a guy named Eric, cursed under his breath. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Just stay cool," my mom said, forcing herself to sound calm. "We'll be fine." She turned to look out the rear windshield. There were 2 cops. One stayed in the car. The other, a tall, heavy-set man, stepped out and approached. As he got closer, her heart jumped. She knew him. Mr. Nelson. He was a well-respected man in town, in his 40s, married with kids. He went to their church. She had seen him every Sunday for years. Relief flooded her. Maybe they really would be fine. Mr. Nelson leaned down at the driver's window, his face partially obscured by the bright patrol lights. "Having a good night, Miss Kelvin?" My mother swallowed hard. "Sorry, Mr. Nelson," she said, forcing a nervous smile. "We must have been distracting Eric too much." He didn't smile back. "Driver's license and registration." Eric fumbled to hand it over. Mr. Nelson took it, glanced over it, then straightened up. "I'm going to need all of you to step out of the vehicle." My mom's stomach sank. They hesitated, but he repeated the order, voice sharper this time. Slowly, they obeyed. The 4 of them climbed out of the car and stood in the glow of the headlights. The second officer, a younger man my mother didn't recognize, leaned against the hood of the police cruiser, arms crossed. "All right," Mr. Nelson said, looking them over. "Couple ways this can go. We could take you home. Tell your parents everything. Let them deal with you." The air felt thick. The other girls exchanged nervous glances. Or, Mr. Nelson turned to his partner, and the two of them shared a knowing smirk. "You could do something for us." A chill ran through my mother's spine. What kind of thing?" one of the girls asked hesitantly. Mr. Nelson's smirk widened. "I think a strip search is in order." Silence. The world around them, the chirping crickets, the hum of a distant highway, seemed to vanish. My mother's blood went cold. She stared at Mr. Nelson, waiting for him to laugh, to say he was joking, to do something, anything, that made this feel less terrifying than it was. But he didn't. The other officer chuckled under his breath. "Come on," Mr. Nelson said, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "Doesn't have to be a big deal. Just show us a little skin, and this all goes away." The girl stiffened. Eric, standing to the side, clenched his fists. "No," my mother said, barely above a whisper. Mr. Nelson's face darkened. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice dropping. "I'm not asking." The way he said it, so cold, so sure of himself, made her stomach twist. They weren't getting out of this. Not unless they ran. She turned, meeting the wide, tear-filled eyes of her friends. One of them, Rachel, was already shaking, her body trembling like a leaf. "We have to go," my mom whispered. Rachel shook her head. "We can't." "We have to," my mother insisted. Mr. Nelson was watching them now, his smirk gone. He knew what they were thinking. My mother's pulse hammered in her ears. She forced herself to take a deep breath. Then, "Run." They bolted. Rachel screamed as they took off, sprinting toward the cornfield that stretched beside the road. The stalks were tall, dry, and thick, but my mother plunged into them without hesitation. Behind her, she heard shouting, heavy footsteps. Then Rachel shrieked. My mom turned, heart in her throat. Mr. Nelson had grabbed Rachel's arm. For one horrible second, she thought he was going to pull her back, drag her to the ground, but Rachel was faster. She twisted, kicked out blindly, and wrenched herself free. They ran deeper into the cornfield. The stalks cut their skin, leaves slapping their faces as they barreled forward, lungs burning. Behind them, the shouting stopped. The footsteps stopped. They reached the other side of the field and collapsed into the grass, panting, their hearts hammering like war drums. They waited. 10 minutes. 15. The cops never followed. Finally, when they were sure the police car was gone, they made their way back to the road. Their car was still there. The headlights were still on. But the cops were gone. No sirens. No lights. Nothing. They never reported what happened. Because who would have believed them? Mr. Nelson was a respected man in town. He had a wife, kids, a career. He was seen as good, upstanding. If 4 drunk teenagers accused him of something like that, no one would have taken their side. So they stayed quiet. And every Sunday, my mother had to sit in church and see him. And every Sunday, he would smile at her and wink, as if to remind her. She never forgot. She never will. It was just after midnight when I saw the headlights in my rearview mirror. I had been driving home from a date, a little nervous because I wasn't technically supposed to be out this late. In my town, minors weren't allowed to be on the roads past 11 p.m. without a good reason. The cops were notoriously strict about it, especially since the town had almost no real crime, just teenagers smoking weed or sneaking out past curfew. I was on a quiet stretch of road, surrounded by empty parking lots and closed businesses, when the headlights behind me moved closer. Too close. The car had been following me for at least 5 miles, sticking unnervingly close to my bumper despite the road being nearly deserted. Then the red and blue lights flicked on. I tensed. I had never been pulled over before. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I forced myself to take deep breaths. It's fine, I told myself. Probably just a curfew stop. Just be polite. I signaled and pulled into an empty gas station lot, parking under the glow of a single flickering street lamp. I put my car in park, turned off the engine, and rolled down my window, my heart pounding as I reached for my license and registration. The officer approached. Something about him felt off. He leaned down, resting both arms against my open window. I could smell his cologne, thick and artificial, mixed with something else, something stale. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with an angular face and shaggy blonde hair that was longer than most cops would have been allowed to keep. But what really caught my attention was his uniform. It looked almost right. The dark fabric, the badge pinned to the chest, the utility belt, all the things you'd expect. But his pants were too short. The cuffs awkwardly exposed several inches of his pale, bony ankles. That was the first red flag. "Evening," he said smoothly. His voice was light, casual, almost friendly. "Know why I pulled you over?" I swallowed. "No, sir." He smirked. "I do." Something cold settled in my stomach. I glanced at the car he had stepped out of. It looked like a normal unmarked police vehicle, but something was missing. There was no visible department insignia, no badge number, just a plain civilian license plate. The second red flag. "Where you headed?" the officer asked. "Home." He nodded like he already knew the answer. "That your car?" I frowned. "Yeah." He exhaled, drumming his fingers against my door. His other hand rested lightly on his belt, not near a gun, but near the handcuffs. "Listen," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You mind pulling around behind the building? Just want to have a quick chat away from the road." My pulse jumped. There was absolutely no reason for me to do that. There were no other cars around. No witnesses. The gas station was closed for the night, its windows dark and empty. If I drove behind that building, I would be completely out of sight. The third red flag. I forced a small, nervous smile. Sure. Just hold on a second." He nodded, stepping back slightly, and I reached down, not for the gear shift, but for my phone. I dialed 911. The second I heard the operator's voice, I kept my own voice light and casual. "Hey," I said, as if I were talking to a friend. "Just got pulled over by an unmarked car, civilian plates, no visible badge number. Just want to confirm it's legit." The officer's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. There was silence on the other end of the line for a few seconds. Then the dispatcher's voice returned, tense. "That's not one of ours." A rush of ice shot through my veins. "Do not exit the vehicle," the dispatcher continued. "Drive to a public area immediately. Officers are en route." My fingers clenched around the phone. I nodded stiffly. "All right. Thanks." I put my car in drive. The officer frowned. "Go ahead, Indy." I gunned it. The tires screeched as I tore out of the gas station, the force of acceleration slamming me against my seat. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel, knuckles white. For a brief, horrifying second, I thought maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I had just run from a real cop, and now I was in even bigger trouble. Then I saw the flashing lights behind me. He was following. I had never driven so fast in my life. The speedometer climbed past 70, the car vibrating violently beneath me. The fake officer's headlights stayed locked onto me, his car keeping up effortlessly. My breath was coming in short, panicked gasps, my mind screaming at me to think, to do something. I was still on the phone with the dispatcher. "Where are you now?" she asked urgently. I don't know." My voice cracked as I swerved around a slower car, barely avoiding clipping their side mirror. I scanned the road ahead, and then I saw it. A diner. It had been out of business for years, but I knew something important about that parking lot. There was always a real police cruiser parked there. A speed trap. A hiding spot for cops waiting to catch reckless drivers. I swerved off the main road and into the empty lot, tires screeching as I braced myself, heart hammering. But the parking lot was empty. No police cars. No one. Just me. And the fake officer. I froze, gripping the wheel so tightly my fingers ached. The sound of another car door slamming made my stomach drop. I turned, expecting to see the man standing just outside my window, his fake badge glinting under the dim streetlights. But it wasn't him. It was real police officers. 3 marked squad cars had pulled up behind us, their lights flashing wildly in the darkness. 5 or 6 officers swarmed the parking lot, guns drawn, their voices sharp and commanding as they shouted at the man behind me. For a split second, I thought maybe I had been wrong. Maybe I had just run from a real officer, and now I was about to be arrested. But then, the fake cop turned and ran. He bolted back toward his car, but 2 officers tackled him before he could reach it. He fought wildly, thrashing and snarling as they forced him to the ground. I sat there, shaking, unable to move. A real officer knocked on my window. "You okay?" I managed a nod, my whole body trembling. Later, at the station, they told me the truth. The man wasn't a cop. He wasn't anything. Just a predator with a stolen uniform and an unmarked car. A man who had been pulling over young women late at night. A man who had raped some. A A man who had killed one. And if I hadn't run? If I had pulled behind that building like he told me to? I don't think I would have made it home. There's a certain kind of silence that only exists in the middle of nowhere. The kind where your own breathing sounds too loud, where the distant rustle of unseen creatures in the darkness feels unnatural, where even the trees seem to hold their breath. That was the silence I woke up to the night I almost died. I had been backpacking through Australia for months, living out of my van like so many other travelers. It was the cheapest way to see the country, and I loved the freedom pulling over wherever I wanted, waking up to new landscapes every morning. But that night, I made a mistake. It had been a long day of driving. Hours of winding roads, distant mountains blurring into the horizon, the sun setting in a smear of deep oranges and purples. The isolation had been peaceful at first, but as night settled in, my exhaustion started to weigh on me. My eyelids were heavy, my thoughts sluggish. When I saw the rest stop sign, I didn't think twice. It was just a small clearing off the highway, one of those bare-bones stops with a single trash bin, no bathrooms, no vending machines. I had parked in places like this before. Normally, I made sure to stop somewhere with at least a few other travelers or truckers around. But that night, I was too tired to care. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and locked the doors. The van creaked as I climbed into the back, drawing the curtains shut before collapsing onto my mattress. I barely had time to register the silence before sleep swallowed me. Then, a knock. It was sharp, too deliberate to be the wind. I jolted awake, my mind struggling to catch up with my racing heart. I blinked into the darkness, disoriented. Had I imagined it? Then another knock. Louder this time. A voice followed. Police. Open up. Instantly, my grogginess vanished. I sat up, heart pounding. My mind was still sluggish from sleep, but something about that voice, something in the tone, felt off. I stayed completely still, listening. The voice came again, more impatient now. Open up. It's the police. My first instinct was to obey, to pull back the curtain, unlock the door, and apologize for whatever I had done wrong. But then, why would the police be here? I wasn't parked illegally. I hadn't done anything wrong. And if they were really cops, wouldn't they have sirens? Flashing lights? Wouldn't they announce themselves more clearly? Something was wrong. A deep, twisting unease coiled in my stomach. I forced myself to move silently, crawling toward the front of the van. I reached out, just barely peeling back the curtain, just enough to see outside. And that's when my blood ran cold. A man stood next to my van. He wasn't a cop. No uniform. No badge. Just a dark hoodie pulled over his head, his face mostly hidden in shadow. His stance was too casual, like he was waiting for something. Then I saw movement. Someone else. A second figure was emerging from the trees just beyond the rest stop, stepping into the faint glow of the moonlight. There were two of them. My stomach twisted painfully. They weren't here to help me. They were here for me. The man knocked again, harder this time. Come on, mate. Open up. I couldn't breathe. I could feel my own heartbeat pounding in my chest, each beat a desperate signal telling me, this is real. This is happening. They thought I was stupid. Thought I would just open the door, groggy and confused, rubbing my eyes like some clueless backpacker. And then what? I didn't want to find out. I needed to act fast. Swallowing my fear, I pressed my back against the van wall and forced my voice to sound as steady as possible. I have a gun, I called out. And I'm calling the cops. Silence. A long, horrible silence. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Moving away from the van. I waited, barely breathing. Through the tiny gap in the curtain, I saw them. The first man was backing toward a car I hadn't noticed before, an old, beat-up sedan parked just out of the reach of the moonlight. The second man was already inside. The driver's side door creaked open, and the man climbed in without another word. Then, the car roared to life. I watched as it turned sharply, peeling out of the rest stop and vanishing down the empty road. I didn't move. Not for a long time. I forced myself to listen, to truly listen, to the silence outside. No footsteps. No voices. No shuffling near the van. Only then did I crawl into the driver's seat, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I turned the ignition. The van hesitated, making a horrible sputtering sound, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought it wouldn't start. But then, the engine roared to life. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I drove for miles, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. My mind was racing. What if I had opened the door? What if I had hesitated too long? The thought made me nauseous. I kept driving until I saw the warm glow of a 24-hour truck stop up ahead. Bright lights, other vehicles, people. I pulled in, parked between two massive semi-trucks, and locked the doors. I exhaled shakily, trying to slow my racing heart. Only then did I let myself think about what had almost happened. It wasn't a random act. Those men had been waiting. They had been watching the highway, looking for someone like me, a lone traveler, exhausted, vulnerable. They had been patient. And if I had made one wrong move, if I had opened that door, I would have disappeared. Just another name on a list of missing backpackers. Just another ghost swallowed by the Australian outback. I sat there, staring blankly at the dashboard, the weight of it all crashing down on me. And I knew, without a doubt, that I had survived that night by sheer instinct. And by the sickening realization that somewhere out there, that car was still driving, still hunting, still waiting for the next traveler too tired to think twice.